Thank you, Madhavi. Hello again to this encore session, and welcome everybody to today's live podcast hosted by the Journal of Medical Device Regulation. My name is Maria. I'm an editorial assistant with the journal, and we are really thrilled to have you here as we dive into the world of social media advertising for medical devices. It is very nice to meet you all. Thank you for joining this event, for taking some of your precious time, and for wanting to learn or broaden or confirm your knowledge about this topic. Joining us is Madhavi Bellamkonda, a leading expert in digital marketing regulations and compliance. She'll walk us through what's allowed and what's not when promoting medical devices online. Madhavi has prepared some slides for you, but please feel free to drop your questions in the chat as they come to your mind, and I will monitor a little bit the conversations. So let's get started. Madhavi, would you like to say a few words about yourself and your role in the medical device industry?
Yes. First of all, thank you, Maria, for hosting this session. Really appreciate it. It's an encore because we did get, I got additional notes and, comments from the first session. So, and thank you to the folks who have taken the time to join this session as well. We really appreciate it. So as Maria mentioned, the topic for today is direct to consumer advertising and social media advertising of medical devices. What sparked this essentially is, I had written an article for the Journal of Medical Device Regulation a few months ago, and you can actually find that article, in the journal itself. But before we dive into the content, I do want to mention that this session is meant to be, conversational. I have slides for the sake of, just basic direction for the conversation, but I don't want to go into a deep dive, just one-sided presentation. So please feel free to stop me, ask me any questions that you have on social media and direct to consumer or direct to patient advertising. And let me just, so this is the journal that Maria mentioned. You can actually find my article in the journal. If you'd like to subscribe and get a copy, please feel free to do that. I know Maria can share a link to that as well once we end this call.
Sure.
Sorry, go ahead. Any questions?
No, I just said sure, of course.
Yeah, so for those of you whom I've not had the pleasure of meeting, I know some of you on the call and really appreciate you taking the time. And for those of you whom we've not had the pleasure of connecting at all, my name is Madhavi Bellamkonda, as Maria mentioned. I have been in the space of medical device advertising and promotion for almost 2 decades at this point. Have done this for a better part of my career at different companies, and most recently I started my own company called as Swasti AI, offering services and building products for medical device advertising and promotion. So a part of what I'm doing is also sharing knowledge. I'm having an educational series where I will be sharing tidbits, knowledge I've gained, experience I've gained over the years with the teams, just to make sure everybody has the benefit of some of the pain points that I've gone through that I can actually share with you, so you could potentially avoid certain pitfalls. So the first slide, just to give some backdrop for those of you who may have not seen my article in the journal. The article itself was focused on FDA related advertising and promotion and advertising directly to consumers and social media of medical devices in the US in particular. While that was a US centric article, I do want to mention for the call today, definitely any questions from all parts of the world are welcome. I've had experience in working with all regions, in several capacities in my previous life. I have worked, with the EMEA region, with the APAC region, with LATAM, Canada, US, of course, goes without saying. So broad scope, definitely for the call today. So feel free to ask questions, even about other parts of the world and not just focusing on the US. But from a US, standpoint, just given, the article that I had actually mentioned, I do want to mention the agencies or the authorities that essentially oversee social media and direct to consumer advertising in the US. So we of course have the US FDA. In addition to the US FDA, we also have what is called as the Federal Trade Commission, which also basically oversees all advertising and promotion, including medical device advertising and promotion in the United States. The reason AdvaMed is mentioned here is AdvaMed is basically a trade association. It is not a regulator. However, AdvaMed has put out certain principles that actually apply to direct-to-consumer advertising of medical devices as well. So that's the reason why AdvaMed is included here. There is a link, I'm happy to share the link for those principles as well. So broadly speaking, we have the FDA, FTC, and the AdvaMed, who are, the different kind of authorities that actually regulate advertising and promotion directly to patients, the advertising and promotion on social media as well for medical devices. I do want to draw a distinction between social media and direct-to-consumer advertising. So for those of you who are familiar with this may sound very basic. For those of you who are here to learn a little bit more about this, any advertising or promotional activity that you have directly to patients is what is called as, DTCA, or direct-to-consumer advertising, direct-to-patient advertising in certain instances as well. So if you look at social media, when used to talk to patients directly or advertise to patients directly, will be considered as direct-to-consumer advertising. So in the United States, one of the important things to keep in mind, especially if you're tuning in from other parts of the world, US is one of the only companies that actually does allow direct-to-consumer advertising of prescription medical products. In most parts of the world, essentially, we do not have the ability to advertise prescription medical devices, prescription pharmaceutical products. None of these can really be advertised, to customers, essentially to patients directly. So US is unique in this regard. From that standpoint, in the US, you do have certain set of requirements that actually need to be followed when you are advertising to patients directly. We'll talk a little bit about that. Here's the link to the AdvaMed. We'll share that link as well so you can look at it. But AdvaMed, which is a trade association, actually does have certain principles that medical device companies really need to follow when creating direct-to-consumer advertising or direct-to-patient advertising. I'm going to pause here because, Maria, do I see a question or a comment in chat?
That's just me saying that everybody can drop their questions or interrupt you directly.
Okay, yeah. Sure.
Question.
Yeah, thanks for that. So any questions so far or comments? Just want to make sure,
Just a comment, maybe. Just
Yeah.
a comment from a European perspective, because over here, I'm based in Spain and London, and over here we're really not used to seeing any prescription drug advertising on TV or anywhere, actually. Certainly not on TV, maybe on social media, but it's not as common as in the US for certain.
Yeah, great point, Maria. It is very rare that you see the type of advertising that we see in the US in any other part of the world, actually. So US is unique, from that regard. I do receive questions, team, just to give you some additional color. I do receive questions, from some of my clients. Sometimes questions come in about advertising directly to patients in the UK. Most recently, we were talking about, advertising in Australia. So there are other parts of the world where companies are attempting to do some of this, but the regulations are pretty strict. And there's actually prohibitions in many parts of the world where you really cannot talk and promote directly to patients. There are other things that you can do, of course, but the type of advertising that you see in the United States with respect to prescription medical products is pretty uncommon in other parts of the world. That said, for those of you who are actually trying to navigate some of the regulatory requirements in other parts of the world, there are different types of things that you would want to explore as opposed to, just pure product promotion. So we can talk a little bit about that if there are questions in that regard. So maybe I'll just flip to the next slide. So one of the most common things to think about when you're creating advertising and promotion content, whether it's social media or not. So this slide essentially applies to all advertising and promotion. These are global requirements, not restricted to, just one part of the world. When you're creating social media, when you're creating direct-to-consumer advertising, every type of promotional activity will require to follow some basic principles. all of the content, that you put out definitely always has to be truthful, not misleading. It has to be consistent with your approved instructions for use or approved directions for use, whatever you call it. That's what is called as consistent with approved labeling. You also have to make sure that you're supporting the promotional material that you're creating. What is the evidence, that you're using essentially to make the types of claims that you're making? So that is what is supported by substantial evidence. And fair balance essentially is making sure that you do have enough fair balance between risks versus benefits for the products that you're describing your material. So these four principles essentially apply globally to all advertising and promotion. Definitely, of course, still apply to social media. And the reason I kind of, put this slide up is because in social media in particular, sometimes it can get very tricky to kind of establish all four requirements within a short post. However, it is very important that the four fundamental requirements are always kind of considered, even when you create, a small blurb, small post, a few sentences on social media. Definitely the regulators are looking to see if that content is actually compliant with the basic requirements as well. Any questions?
Can I ask? Yes, I have a question. I was wondering how the regulators control this. I mean, are they dependent on somebody reporting a post that is not correct, let's say, or misleading or untruthful, or do they have controls in place? Do they swipe? I mean, do they look for? No, I don't. I actually know how. I don't know how they can control the amount of information published on social media. How can they become aware of
Yeah,
untruthful information or?
a great question, Maria. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you there.
Yeah, no, I was already finished.
Yeah, it's a great question. Definitely, the US FDA does have, their own social media channels. They follow some of the key players, key large organizations. You can easily follow the company. But to your point about volume, right? There is huge volume of content that is typically put out. But FDA is constantly monitoring. I mean, constant in some instances may feel like a stretch, but FDA does have mechanisms in place to monitor content for sure. And two of the areas why this is, such an important area is the two things that FDA is very easily capable of doing is going to your social media channel and going to, the company website, right? So these are the most openly available content, locations for FDA to go in and actually look at what content has been put out. Usually how these, how they look at enforcement or oversight is there are multiple instances and examples where an authority like the FDA will actually look for content related to a specific type of population. For example, we can talk about, pediatric use of products, right? Because it's a very vulnerable population. If it's a pediatric use product, there can be much more oversight over your product compared to maybe an adult use product. That's just one type of example. Another example is, let's say, we had COVID, obviously, just a few years ago. Everything related to COVID, there was a lot of oversight in what was being put out. Smaller companies, actually. So one of the things to also keep in mind is sometimes a lot of smaller companies can think that, well, I'm not a very big player. I don't, probably FDA will not care about what I do, and it's only the large, players that usually get in trouble. That's really not the case. There are multiple instances where FDA actually has issued, untitled letters, warning letters, things like that. They've actually taken action even against small players. It really depends upon the type of technology that you're putting out and the type of impact, that technology has. So they are monitoring web content, Maria, to answer your question. Especially the other mechanism now is every company goes through audits for the most part. There is, what you call as the MDSAP audit. where FDA has partnered with other regulators in other parts of the world, and there is like it's a single audit program essentially. So one authority will come in and they will audit for multiple different regions. And during those audits, what has happened now, even because of EU MDR, advertising and promotion has kind of become like, a routine part of the audit. So it's kind of on the checklist of things that auditors are looking for. And in my recent experience, actually, when I was involved in an audit, FDA, it wasn't FDA, but it was a regulator who came and he was looking for specifically social media content that was put out by that company, most recently. So they can come in through audit as well and actually ask you, show me your latest, for example, LinkedIn post, show me your latest Facebook post, right? So these things are very real. They do happen. So oversight happens both organically, just, in the universe as they're looking at your web content, but also through audits, they can actually come in and ask you, a question quite directly.
Very interesting. Thank you, Madhavi.
Was there a question or a comment? I see something on chat, Maria.
Yes, Vanessa just wrote a question. I'm reading, right? In the US, there seems to be a lot of enforcement in the drug space, and we see this with the untitled warning letters. But in the medical device space, there doesn't seem to be much enforcement, such as with Fair Balance, even though the guidance is clear that it applies to both drugs and medical devices.
Yes, it's a great comment, Vanessa. I think a lot of times when you do risk analysis for your promotional material, while looking at the regulatory requirements, Fair Balance and everything else that goes in with the piece, one of the things that every company typically should be looking at is also the type and the level of enforcement for, the type of product that you make. In medical devices, you're absolutely right that the number of instances of untitled letters, warning letters is much lower compared to the pharmaceutical side of things. I think the key difference essentially is because the pharmaceutical side actually has a whole department within the FDA that monitors advertising and promotion, quite directly. On the medical device side, FDA has really not had, any specific body that is routinely monitoring and having very detailed oversight over medical device advertising. That said, one of the things we've always considered, like in my past life during risk analysis, one of the things we've always considered is it's not about, just because FDA hasn't done something, they will not do it in the future state. Anything can happen at any time. It is quite unpredictable. One of the other ways to look at it is while they may not issue untitled letters. So in my lifetime, I've seen, at least two, warning letters, which is not a lot compared to the pharmaceutical side, in a almost 2 decade, time period. But it depends on a number of things. It depends on the relationship a company has with the FDA from a regulatory standpoint. In certain instances, while they may not, just out of the blue issue a warning letter, there are multiple instances where the FDA has actually been using a different approach with medical devices in particular. They call, the company and say, hey, we've noticed something on your website. Do you want to address it before we kind of take any particular action? So FDA has taken that approach in several instances where they're trying to keep it a little more collaborative with medical device companies, where they do call the company and kind of highlight, issues. And of course, there are instances where they will issue untitled letters or also through, the audit. Right now, I think the audit is another piece that's kind of highlighting some of the issues. But great comment. Does it answer your thoughts or questions, Vanessa?
Yes, thank you.
I have another question for you, Madhavi.
Sure.
Can you give us an example of substantial evidence from Kimya Insaf?
Yeah, excellent question. So substantial evidence can be information that you potentially take from your instructions for use. Substantial evidence can be, let's say you have clinical data from a recently published journal article, from a journal article, for example, you can use your journal article, as substantial evidence. Sometimes you have in-house testing, meaning as a company, you're doing internal bench testing, like your R&D department, maybe, looking at testing your product versus a competitor product, or just even your product for the features and benefits and performance of your product. So internal bench testing data, R&D reports is also considered as substantial evidence. These are the classic, substantial types of substantial evidence that you want to typically use. Your IFUs, which are typically approved by either, your CE marking process or your regulatory authority process. Journal articles, which are published, journal articles, because they are peer reviewed for the most part, really high standard of, or high level of evidence. So journal articles, IFUs, in-house bench testing data. Sometimes you also have things like market intelligence reports, where you do market research and your market intelligence team may have come up with a report that you can potentially use as substantial evidence as well. Does that help?
Yes, thank you so much.
Okay, let's keep going. Anything else, Maria?
Not for now, no.
Okay.
You're good to go.
So this next slide, I wanted to talk just a little bit more about when you create direct to consumer or direct to patient, advertising. The 4 principles that we just talked about on the previous slide definitely apply. But in addition to that, the difference between promoting to a doctor or a hospital versus promoting to a patient also lies in the type of information you put in your piece. So when you're promoting to a patient, or having direct to consumer, direct to patient advertising, the type of messaging that you have in your piece generally should be in a form which can be easily understood by a layperson, because you're not talking to a doctor, you're potentially talking to a layperson who may not know all the technicalities and technical details of a product. So it's really important to use terminology and language which is pretty simple and easy to understand. Usually it's considered like a 6th grade or 8th grade level terminology is what you want to use. Then the other important factor to consider, especially in the United States, we have what is called as the important safety information, which is where you're balancing the risk versus benefit information in your piece. If you insert the important safety information into your patient facing pieces, even the important safety information has to be simplified. Usually the important safety information comes from your instructions for use or directions for use, but as you may be aware, the instructions for use for a technical product usually are hard to understand as a layperson. So even that language has to be simplified, and the simplified version of the important safety information is what you typically want to put into your promotional piece when you're wanting to promote directly to patients. Of course, in all parts of the world, for the most part right now, we have privacy laws. So patient privacy information heavily protected in different parts of the world. So consider, whether it's GDPR or whether in the US it's HIPAA, we have to be very careful about not inadvertently exposing, patient specific information, patient personal information. Right. So these are some of the very high level requirements when you're creating promotional content and trying to target essentially patients, directly. So I'm going to make one more comment and then pause and see if you have any questions. One of the frequent questions I've received in the past is, in fact, more recently, somebody had also asked me about this, is what is the difference between direct to consumer advertising, meaning what is the difference between a direct to patient piece versus a patient educational booklet that you might provide to a hospital? Is the patient educational booklet also considered as direct to consumer advertising? So in a classic regulatory fashion, the answer is really, it truly depends. However, just to make sure it's kind of clear for the group, a patient educational booklet is something that you can create as a company and provide to your doctor and to the hospital, and expect the doctor actually to share it with the patients. In that case, as you can imagine, the company that is creating the patient educational booklet is not directly talking to the patient. right? So you are not really having any direct engagement with the patient itself. So while the language will still need to be pretty simple so the patients can actually understand it, definitely it is not considered as direct to consumer advertising traditionally, because you as the company didn't hand out the patient educational booklet to the patient directly. You actually still gave it to the doctor in the hospital. So there's a slight nuance in how you want to manage, direct to consumer advertising. Definitely keep in mind that the basic principles always will continue to apply. So it's always, back to first principles, whether you're talking to a hospital, doctor, or to a patient. Okay. Any questions, comments? I did have a question here for the group, so feel free to raise your hand or put it in the chat. So all social media advertising is DTCA. So is that true or false? So feel free to either speak up or put something in the chat, and we can talk about this for a second.
I'm thinking, I'm sure that it's a trick question.
Yeah. Yeah, so let me, like we have, I set this up for 45 minutes because it is a follow-up call from our previous session. So I can, kind of speak to this a little bit. So obviously all social media is not considered as direct to consumer advertising.
I was going to say that.
Yeah, great. The tricky part is you have to make sure that whatever social media content you're creating is catering to the audience that you're targeting. So it's very critical how you design your social media content. When you create social media content directed to physicians, you have to say that, you have to say your post is meant for physicians. So it's really important to make sure that you actually call out, your audience type and also the region typically, because if you're not able to geo-target, geo-targeting can also be very tricky on social media. So really important to keep in mind that the intention behind your social media post has to be self-evident in the social media post. So if you are indeed creating social media posts that are directed to physicians and hospitals, you want to say that in your social media post, then technically you really are not targeting patients. So at least you have an argument to be made that I wasn't targeting patients, I'm not really doing direct to consumer advertising. But if you avoid some of the watch outs, some of the, just some of the cautionary things in social media, what can happen with your post is it can simply be implied that you are essentially advertising to everybody, including patients, right? So that's where it gets very tricky on how you handle, what type of content you put, what channel you put it on, and how you target your audience. So this is a little bit more just about what I've already spoken about, just making it a little more explicit about how FDA has talked about social media in particular. FDA has been very clear that the same basic principles I talked about will apply. One of the reasons I put the slide on is FDA also very clearly says that platforms can differ. The features on a platform can differ. So it's really important that if you cannot achieve following the basic social media and DTCA principles on a certain platform, FDA basically says, if you see at the end of the sentence, FDA basically says that you should reconsider using that platform for the intended promotional message. So they're pretty clear that they're not going to have any kind of exceptions to the rule for technical reasons, meaning if a channel does not permit you to put the important safety information or the risk information, it doesn't mean FDA is going to give you some kind of an exception that it's the channel's problem and not your problem. You still are the one liable to ensure that all basic requirements are followed, regardless, of the channel type where you're posting your content. So important distinction to keep in mind. Before we go into influencers, we're not going to do a deep dive, in the interest of time. This is a whole topic by itself, but I did want to touch on it because it's such a heavy topic with respect to social media and direct to consumer advertising. A lot of companies are using influencers. One comment I will make about, the channels, we're not talking specific channels as well. There are some nuances from a channel standpoint as well. One of the reason FDA also talked about, reconsider the platform that you want to use. some of you may already be aware that in Instagram, there is no possibility for you to insert a link to the important safety information. So there is some risk with the type of content you're going to put on Instagram when you cannot, provide fair balance between the risk and benefit information. So just one nuance from a channel standpoint. Any questions, comments before we move to influencers?
I was just wondering if you see that direct to consumer for medical devices is increasing recently, or I don't know. I mean, social media activity is increasing, but it sounds really challenging to manage it really well. So I was wondering, is it increasing, or are companies still shying away from using social media more than necessary?
No, great question, Maria. I think companies continue to explore it. I can't, for medical devices in particular, I can't say it is increasing, but I would definitely say that compared to a few years ago, it definitely has increased. The approach is slightly different. A lot of companies try to have advertising on Facebook. They use patient advocacy groups, which is slightly different from going directly to consumers, directly to patients. Definitely, companies are exploring different opportunities. One good example, in the recent past is all things diabetes. Because there's all kinds of new glucose measuring devices that have come out. So there is definitely an uptick in how advertising of those types of devices, just as an example, are being put out more to consumers directly. So it really depends, but I would say compared to a few years ago, the volume certainly has increased. More opportunity to explore. I think companies are willing to explore and take a certain type of risk by, going directly to consumer, especially when they see, potential benefit, right? It all depends on, do you really have a benefit, when you take the risk, right? Unless there is a benefit, there's really no point in taking the risk. So sometimes, the how you do the assessment is, if there is really a huge benefit but also a huge risk, then there's a business decision that can be made that we are indeed going to take a risk because we see a certain type of benefit. Of course, trying to, of course, make sure that you're still compliant. So I think compared to the past, some potential increase, I would say, Maria, because technologies have also increased. Patients are now more aware than compared to the past, right? So it's definitely changing.
Thank you.
Sure. This next couple of slides, I think we only have two more slides. Like I said, it's not, a one-sided presentation, but just to kind of give some shape to the discussion we're having today. With respect to influencers and, specifically using celebrities, it is much more common today to use celebrities and influencers for social media advertising. I think a lot of companies are doing this. We also similarly, as the use of celebrities and influencers has increased, we've also seen, the enforcement also changing in the space, especially on the pharmaceutical side, but it's not entirely, just restricted to pharmaceutical side. So influencers, as you can, see on the slide, the celebrity or the influencer who is actually participating in the advertisement has a certain set of requirements to follow, in addition to, of course, the company that is, the manufacturer of the product itself. So the best practice always is for the manufacturer to work very closely with the influencer to make sure that there is actually adequate oversight over the content that the celebrity is going to mention in his or her, channel. The celebrity, celebrities themselves are actually also liable for the content that they're talking about on their channel. A very good example that some of you may be familiar with from a while back now is the Kim Kardashian post that she had put on Instagram for I think it was, anyway, I'm blanking on the drug now, but it was a huge deal because Kim Kardashian also received a letter from the FDA, including the company that manufactured, the product. So Kim actually had to put out a correction on her Instagram channel saying that it was a mistake, and she kind of had to go through the whole motion of correction. In addition to the company also, of course, responding to the FDA. So influencers and using influencers, I think, is becoming more and more common, and so is FDA oversight over the use of celebrities, on these, on these types of advertising. Very recent example I will share is, obviously all of this is public information, folks. The recent example is, I picked AbbVie because this is obviously, a big name and a big brand. This product was for migraine, and Serena Williams was the celebrity who was, in this ad. It was actually also a TV ad, I believe. And very interesting, response from the FDA. They actually really took the ad apart. We won't have time to do a deep dive on just analyzing, how FDA looked at this ad, but they really had so many comments about how this ad was kind of, not meeting the FDA standards, including, Serena Williams's expressions at the beginning of the ad, middle of the ad, end of the ad, the music, all kinds of things, are taken into account when you look at ads on TV or ads on social media. And for the most part, you may be familiar that these are like, typically 30-second ads, right? They're very, very short, but really packed, with information. So FDA is scrutinizing, definitely looking for, looking out for these things. This was a question I did receive. Can individuals face consequences for FDA enforcement actions? Yes, there have been instances where, a senior officer within a company is named in, in warning letters, untitled letters. There are individuals who are, who potentially are held accountable from a company standpoint. So it is kind of an interesting space, to be in and to be careful about. So any questions, comments, anything from the team?
Not right now, I think.
Okay. Maria, I think there was just one more slide. I think this was a question you had from the last time, right? About what does, what is the role of AI at this point in all of this? Is there anything that will change, just because of how much AI is going to kind of change everything, I guess, in the universe at this point? So when we talked about this the last time, the comment I had made was, the reason, this is Scarlett Johansson's, some of you may also be familiar that Scarlett Johansson essentially sued OpenAI because OpenAI wanted to use Scarlett Johansson's voice for their agent. Just like how you have Siri on the iPhone or Alexa on Amazon, they tried to use her voice, and she actually denied them from using her voice. But OpenAI ended up really making up her voice, like they used AI to regenerate her voice, ended up using her voice, without her permission. So now there's a whole lawsuit going on between Scarlett Johansson and OpenAI. I haven't followed the latest, but this is a kind of a big deal because it is the first of its kind lawsuit involving AI, and it kind of just opens a window into how AI will become a part of everything, right? We're talking celebrities at this point. We just mentioned how celebrities are heavily used in advertising. So if AI is used instead of the actual celebrity, which is a future we potentially are heading to, there is a whole different set of requirements potentially for the FDA to come up with, which we don't have any of that just yet. But I think time will tell, but definitely something to watch out for, and definitely keep an open mind about actually navigating AI in the future.
Yes, I was wondering because in Europe we have the AI Act, but you don't have anything similar in the US yet, right?
No, we don't. Definitely EU is ahead of the game in that regard. Maria, US does not have any specific AI related regulation at this point. There is definitely guidance that has come out, but no real regulation at this point. So, yeah.
I have one last question for you from my list.
Go ahead.
How do manufacturers need to consider social media advertising in the technical documents?
Social media advertising in technical documents? I'm not sure I understand that question. You mean how do you use technical documents for social media?
Does it have to be considered in the technical documentation about your medical device? I don't know.
Not in your technical documentation. So keep in mind, there are, I mean, I think maybe two-part question, Maria. One is if you have, social media in general, and you're talking technical details about your product, one of the things I usually advise people is not to go too technical into your product on social media because you only have a limited space to talk about your product. You don't want to have too many technical details because what will end up happening is you will have to substantiate all of those claims, and it gets too complicated in a short, space and short, window, right? You only have a small space for the post. In your technical documentation itself, so if you're saying that, do we have to mention social media somewhere on technical documentation? Really not required anywhere at this point. Like I said, one of the things that is happening only from an audit standpoint, relatively frequent now, is the auditors, are external auditors, are coming in asking directly about your social media content. So even if they potentially see it on, let's say LinkedIn or somewhere, they will still ask you for a copy and say, hey, show me the evidence of, possibly approval of your social media content, right? So from a tech, and some of the posts can be technical content, right? There are social media posts that are created with technical content, and you can get questions. Definitely you can get questions. One difference, I will say, key difference from compared to the past maybe 5 years to today, clearly is the audit piece. So back in the day, advertising and promotion, I'm talking several years ago now, it wasn't like truly a part of every audit checklist. FDA, even if FDA came in, they would collect materials for promotional, that your promotional materials, and take them back with them for assessment, especially on the medical device side of things. But now with MDSAP audits and with EU MDR audit happening, I think the key difference is it is definitely a part of the entire audit process, and people do come in and ask specifically questions about your promotional activity, especially if they have a wind of some issue, or if something has come up in the past, definitely something for you to be, watchful about. Does that answer your question, Maria?
Yes, thank you.
I think, Madhavi, like as per my understanding, like we can include in the clinical evaluation of claim section. So we can discuss the source against what are the sources we have used to represent the claim. Um, so we can use it in the clinical evaluation
Yes.
reports.
Yes, Manohar, thanks for joining and lovely to meet you. Yes,
Yeah.
you are right that in CEP CERs, definitely in your clinical evaluation plan and clinical evaluation report, because there is a wealth of information from a clinical evidence perspective, you can certainly talk about the types of marketing claims you want to make based on the clinical evidence that you're putting into your into your CEP or CER, right? That is also a source for the claims. One thing to keep in mind is sometimes, CEP/CERs, you may not always have published data. So I would only mention one cautionary statement about published versus unpublished data, right? Published data, obviously, top tier level of evidence, much more, substantial evidence compared to unpublished data, right? Sometimes you may have, internal reports as well that you are okay to put into your clinical evaluation plan. But when you use that type of evidence to actually support marketing claims and external facing documents, something for you to consider, right? Depends on the level of risk you want to take, type of evidence you want to use, if it is related to unpublished evidence in particular.
Yeah, exactly. Of course. Yeah. Thank you.
Well, these are the questions, and we can go through these one by one. I know that some of the things I got on LinkedIn I've already answered, and I kind of sprinkled those throughout the conversation. So I think one of the questions we had was, do we need to include indications in social media and direct-to-consumer advertising for class 2 medical devices? Great question. One nuance I want to draw with the team here is that when we say indications, that exactly what this is implying. Indications obviously is different from the full important safety information. Class 3 medical devices in the United States typically require you to include the indications in addition to adding the full important safety information. Class 2 medical devices don't require that. But when it comes to social media and direct to consumer advertising, actually what industry has been doing for since social media has started is basically putting, a one-click link to the important safety information. So no additional inclusion of indications is actually being done by industry as a practice. Now, not that the FDA has come out and said that they're okay with it, but it's almost become an industry norm at this point to at least have, the one-click link to the important safety information on social media when it pertains, especially to the United States. Important nuance to draw. So thank you for the question. On this one, I think it's important to understand some nuance does exist between class 2 and class 3 medical devices. The answer to this question is no, you do not need to include the indications for class 2 medical devices on social media. However, you do need to include the one-click link to your full important safety information, whether it's a class 2 or class 3, doesn't really matter. Other questions, examples of social media. I did want to, yeah.
Madhavi, sorry, can I ask you a question from the chat from Vanessa?
Please.
Okay, when is it required to cite the substantiation for your claim in the ad promo piece?
Always.
We linked substantiation in Viva during the review/approval process, but when is it required to cite the substantiation in the ad promo piece that the patient/HCP will see?
Always. So keep in mind, I'm going to use a simple example. I don't have a visual on this. Whether you use a journal publication, let's say you use a journal publication and you're using Viva, you link to your publication. On the same slide, you have to have the citation for the journal publication. It is always required. Let's say your substantial evidence is actually internal data. It is based on R&D testing. You will link to the test report in Viva, which will be helpful for the reviewers to check, when they do the review. However, on the actual slide or piece, you will have to at least say source data on file at, name your company. So it is at a minimum, you will need to mention where that data came from, whether the citation is going through to a journal, whether the citation is related to internal data use, whatever is the citation is always required on your material. Because remember, especially for folks who are using Viva, I think this can get a little bit confusing because you have all the links to all of the substantial evidence that the reviewers see during the review process. But remember, all of the stuff that you do in Viva is internal. Nobody from an external audience perspective has access to those links or any of that stuff, right? So from an external audience perspective, transparency in terms of substantial evidence is absolutely critical. So when you create content and actually have links, whether it's to journals, IFUs, test reports, whatever it may be, on the same token, you have to make sure that your content actually has the citations to the journal report, to the internal testing data, to the IFU, whatever is required has to be written up on the slide itself. A lot of times people forget to do that on the actual slide because they're too busy creating the links. And I know it's a lot of work, to kind of balance both, but it's always required. Does that answer your question, Vanessa?
Yes, very helpful. Thank you.
Helpful resources to learn more about social media. I did want to share with the group. I'm actually starting, at the end of this month, I'm actually starting some courses, some small group courses. So 6 to 9 is the max class size I'm going to be having, but I will be having courses on, just fundamentals of advertising and promotion, multiple different topics within the fundamentals section, but I'm also going to have, a separate course just on social media and DTCA for medical devices. So you can kind of follow me and, I can share that information as I, set up the courses. We already covered, patient brochures on the previous slide. This question is, can I have patient advertising in the EU? So it really depends on what we mean by patient advertising. If we're talking about having clearly product-related promotional activity for prescription medical products in Europe. It's definitely prohibited in many parts of the region. Not a good idea to create, the type of advertising, especially that you see in the United States, typically not done in Europe, as we discussed. Same applies, even to Asia Pacific region and to a large extent, other parts of the world as well, including LATAM. So the answer is no for the traditional advertising. However, there are other types of educational activities that the team can engage in different parts of the world as well. So that, I believe, was my last slide. This is just a snapshot of the courses that I mentioned. I can share that, with the team as we progress here, and you're welcome to join some of my sessions, other sessions as well. Any other
Thank
questions?
you, Madhavi. Yes, I just wanted to ask, does anybody have any other questions? Please don't be shy.
I actually have one more question, and it goes back to patient education sliding towards patient promotion. And like I understand if it's all generic therapy, it's patient education. I've oftentimes in patient brochures done very generic until the very end where we talk about the product. And have used those in Europe even recently. And so was that wrong?
No, so that's why I said it really depends on how you also use them. Leslie, first of all, thank you for the question. So let's say you created the brochure, very high level, you're describing, a technology or potentially, a disease state for patients to really understand what the disease state looks like. If you're giving that brochure to your doctors and to your customers and hospitals, that's okay, right? They are the ones who are then giving it to the patient in context of use, meaning the doctor takes your educational booklet. When the doctor talks to their patients, they're going to say, okay, here's some additional information if you're interested to learn more about this technology type or this disease state type. Very high level type of educational content, if it's distributed in that manner, it is definitely permissible, happens very frequently, so I don't think there's anything wrong.
When you take that piece and put it on your website.
Mm-hmm. Yes, so when you take that piece and put it on your website, depends on which region your website is catering to.
Okay.
So how website, a whole different ballgame, because website is not actually social media, but it is still web content that is accessible potentially by anybody in any part of the world. So with web content, what you want to do is be very careful about distinguishing which part of the world that web content is meant for. Is it meant for specifically the US, meant for specifically for the EU, meant for specific countries in the EU, or meant for general, let's say you break it up by US versus international use, right? So there are certain options that you can always explore in terms of putting content on the web and making it clear that it is meant for a certain audience type in a certain region. You can actually have a justification for it depending on the level of information.
Okay.
And also, like we have some regulations, Madhavi, in EU, like 536/2014. So based on that, like we have to write the information in the lay person language. So the normal person will understand the language. They can and also there are some scales like Flash, Kincaid grade levels. So and also readability test. So based on that, we can provide the information in a readable way for the patients.
Correct. And the
Yeah.
other piece which we didn't cover, great point, Manohar. Thank you for chiming in here. Another point which we didn't cover, if you start moving into different countries, is language. That's the other piece, right? Language becomes very critical because some of the countries in Europe, if you're targeting patients, and if it's, let's say, only disease state information, really no product information at all, you still are required to translate, the language sometimes in certain parts of the world.
Yeah.
Right? So a great point. Thank you for, chiming in there.
Yeah. Thank you, Madhavi. Yeah.
Folks, anything else? Maria? You're on mute.
Sorry. No, I think we are fine. The chat is happy. No other questions, I think.
Okay. Okay, wonderful. Thank you everybody for taking the time and joining the session. Really appreciate the engagement and all of your comments and questions. Watch out for more sessions, like I said, and I'll definitely be having more courses as well. So you can follow me or ping me if you have any questions, even after the fact. I will be sharing a copy of this recording, so you should have access to it. I'll have to figure out. I'm going to post it on a MailChimp site that I'm creating, but you will have a copy of the recording as well. Okay.
Great. Thank you so much, Madhavi, and for you guys for joining and taking the time to attend this podcast. And I hope it was worth your while.
Thank you.
Thank you.